The greatest monsters are often the ones who refuse to become monsters. The bells of Blackthorn Castle began to ring long before midnight, their deep voices rolling across the frost-covered mountains like distant thunder. Every chime echoed through the ancient stone halls, carrying with it a tradition older than any kingdom still standing. Snow drifted silently across the towering walls, collecting on gargoyle statues whose pale faces seemed to watch the valley below with endless patience. Hundreds of candles flickered inside the grand cathedral, their warm glow dancing against polished black marble until every shadow looked alive. Nobles dressed in dark velvet stood shoulder to shoulder beneath towering stained-glass windows, speaking only in whispers. No laughter filled the room. No music softened the silence. Everyone had come to witness what they believed would become the darkest royal wedding in history. At the far end of the aisle stood King Adrian Blackwood. He remained perfectly still beneath the cathedral's vaulted ceiling, his black ceremonial coat trimmed with silver thread fitting him with quiet elegance instead of intimidation. His skin carried the pale tone of polished ivory, almost luminous beneath the candlelight, while his dark hair framed features that seemed carved from marble. Stories claimed he had ruled for more than 4 centuries without aging a single day. Stories also claimed he had never smiled. He did not wear a crown of gold. Instead, a simple silver circlet rested upon his head, reflecting tiny sparks of candlelight whenever he breathed. His crimson eyes never wandered toward the crowd. They remained fixed on the enormous wooden doors at the entrance of the cathedral. When those doors slowly opened, every whispered conversation vanished. Evelyn Carter stepped inside wearing a white wedding gown that flowed behind her like fresh snowfall across midnight stone. She was 24 years old, her fair skin almost glowing beneath the cathedral lights, her hands folded tightly together to hide the slight tremble she refused to admit. She had imagined weddings as joyful celebrations surrounded by family, sunlight, and music. Instead, she walked alone toward a king the world had taught her to fear since childhood. Every measured step echoed across the polished floor. She could feel hundreds of unfamiliar eyes following her, studying her every movement as though history itself held its breath. Somewhere above, an ancient clock hidden within the cathedral tower began marking the final minutes before midnight. 11:55. Each heavy tick settled over the room like another layer of snow. Evelyn kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at the nobles lining the aisle. She had overheard enough during the journey to know what they expected. Some believed the marriage would secure peace between humans and vampires. Others believed it was merely an elegant sacrifice hidden beneath silk and ceremony. The cruelest rumor claimed the vampire king would claim his bride before the final bell stopped ringing. Evelyn had promised herself she would not cry. Not here. Not before strangers. Not before him. She finally reached the altar, stopping only a few feet from Adrian. For the first time, she looked directly into his eyes. They were not filled with hunger. They were not filled with triumph. They carried something she had never expected to find there. Exhaustion. A quiet, immeasurable exhaustion that seemed older than the castle itself. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them until even the candles seemed afraid to flicker. Then the ancient clock sounded again. 11:59. Every noble leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Every servant lowered their gaze. Every guard tightened their grip on polished spears. Midnight was only seconds away. Evelyn's heartbeat became the loudest sound she could hear. She waited for the king to step closer. She waited for the nightmare every story had promised. Instead, Adrian slowly turned away from her. Without touching her hand. Without speaking a single word. Without even looking back. He descended the altar steps alone and walked toward the enormous cathedral doors, his footsteps calm, measured, and impossibly distant. The doors opened before him. Cold winter air swept inside, extinguishing several candles at once. The vampire king disappeared into the snow without explanation, leaving behind an entire kingdom frozen in disbelief and a bride standing alone beneath the silent bells, wondering why the man everyone feared had become the first person that night to refuse what fate itself seemed determined to force upon them. The cathedral remained silent long after the doors had closed behind Adrian. No one moved until the royal steward cleared his throat with careful restraint, as though even the smallest sound might disturb centuries of custom. The ceremony ended without vows, without celebration, and without explanation. Guests drifted into the endless corridors of Blackthorn Castle wearing expressions that balanced somewhere between confusion and fear. Evelyn stood alone beneath the fading candlelight until an elderly housekeeper approached with a respectful bow. "Your Majesty," the woman said softly. The unfamiliar title felt heavier than the jeweled necklace resting against Evelyn's collarbone. She almost turned around, expecting someone else to answer. Instead, the housekeeper smiled gently. "The East Wing has been prepared for you." Evelyn followed in silence. Their footsteps echoed across polished stone floors that reflected rows of crystal chandeliers suspended high above like frozen constellations. Every hallway smelled faintly of cedar, old books, and fresh winter air drifting through narrow stained glass windows. Nothing resembled the haunted fortress described in childhood stories. Paintings lined the walls instead of trophies. Fresh flowers stood in silver vases instead of dark symbols. Even the servants spoke in calm voices, offering warm smiles whenever she met their eyes. It felt strangely human. Her suite overlooked miles of snow-covered forests stretching beneath the moonlight. A fire already crackled inside a marble fireplace, filling the room with gentle warmth. A tray rested beside the window carrying hot tea, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and apple preserves. Someone had even placed a small vase of white roses beside the table. Evelyn frowned. None of this made sense. She had expected locked doors, armed guards, or at the very least constant supervision. Instead, she found comfort waiting for her before she had even arrived. "Who ordered this?" she finally asked. The housekeeper adjusted a folded blanket over the chair before answering. "His Majesty did." Evelyn looked toward the untouched meal. "He knew what I liked?" "His Majesty requested that everything be prepared according to the preferences listed by your family's attendants before your journey." The answer settled quietly inside the room. Not romance. Not affection. Simply consideration. It somehow unsettled Evelyn even more. After the servants departed, she wandered through the spacious chambers, running her fingertips across polished oak bookshelves filled with history, astronomy, music, and poetry. She searched for hidden doors or secret passages but found only ordinary rooms filled with extraordinary care. On a writing desk near the fireplace sat a sealed envelope bearing the royal crest. Her hands hesitated before opening it. Inside rested a single sheet of thick cream-colored paper. The handwriting was elegant, precise, almost impossibly steady. "Lady Evelyn, this marriage was never your choice, and I understand that. Until circumstances allow otherwise, your freedom within the castle is unrestricted. No one shall enter your private chambers without permission. You will never be expected to share my quarters unless you freely choose otherwise. If anything within these walls causes you discomfort, inform the household staff, and it shall be corrected immediately. I apologize that our first meeting occurred under such unfortunate circumstances. Adrian." Evelyn read the letter again. Then a third time. There was no command hidden between the lines. No threat disguised as courtesy. Only distance. Respectful, deliberate distance. She folded the letter carefully and looked beyond the frosted windows where snow continued falling beneath the silver moon. Somewhere beyond the dark gardens, she noticed a solitary figure standing beside an ancient stone fountain. Even from hundreds of feet away, she recognized the pale outline of Adrian's coat. He stood completely alone, facing the frozen forest without moving, as though listening to something only the winter could hear. For a brief moment, Evelyn forgot every frightening story she had ever heard about the Vampire King. Because the lonely figure outside did not resemble a conqueror waiting to claim a prize. He looked like a man carrying a burden far too heavy for anyone to see. Morning arrived quietly over Blackthorn Castle. Pale sunlight filtered through tall arched windows, painting long ribbons of gold across ancient stone floors that had witnessed generations rise and fade beneath the same silent walls. Evelyn had expected to wake surrounded by guards outside her chamber, but when she opened the heavy oak door, the hallway stood empty except for fresh flowers resting upon a polished table beside a window overlooking the frozen gardens. A faint aroma of cinnamon and warm bread drifted through the corridor, mixing with the clean scent of pine carried in by the winter breeze. Somewhere deeper inside the castle, someone was playing a piano. The melody floated gently through the endless halls, soft enough to disappear whenever she stopped walking, only to return again with every careful step. Curiosity pulled her forward. She followed the music past libraries filled with leather-bound volumes, quiet galleries displaying landscapes instead of battle scenes, and balconies where snowflakes settled on carved stone railings before melting into tiny drops of crystal water. The castle felt less like the fortress she had imagined and more like a place that had learned how to live with silence. The music finally stopped before she reached its source. Only the final note lingered in the air like a fading memory. A young maid appeared carrying folded linens and offered a polite smile. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Evelyn returned the greeting before asking, who was playing. The maid glanced toward a nearby doorway. "His Majesty practices every morning before sunrise." Evelyn looked toward the empty music room. A polished grand piano rested beside towering windows overlooking the eastern cliffs. The bench had already been pushed neatly back into place. A single sheet of music remained open, its handwritten notes flowing across yellowed paper with remarkable precision. "Does he always leave before anyone arrives?" Evelyn asked quietly. The maid hesitated before answering. "The king prefers others to enjoy the castle without feeling watched." Those words lingered with Evelyn as she continued exploring. Every servant she met carried the same calm respect, never avoiding questions, never showing fear when Adrian's name was mentioned. Instead, they spoke about him the way families speak about someone dependable. Someone who remembered birthdays, repaired broken roofs after winter storms, and quietly visited the village school every autumn to donate books without announcing where they came from. None of those stories resembled the ruler she had spent years imagining. Near midday, Evelyn wandered into the castle greenhouse, where warm air wrapped around her shoulders the moment the glass doors opened. Exotic flowers bloomed beneath towering panes of crystal despite the snow outside. Butterflies drifted lazily through shafts of sunlight while tiny fountains filled the room with the peaceful sound of flowing water. She knelt beside a white orchid just as another voice spoke behind her. "It only blooms during the coldest months." Evelyn turned quickly. Adrian stood several feet away beside an open doorway leading toward the gardens. He wore a simple charcoal coat instead of royal robes, his silver hair catching the afternoon light until it almost shimmered. For a long moment neither of them moved. "I did not realize anyone was here," Evelyn admitted. Adrian gave a small nod. "That is because I asked the gardeners to leave once they told me you were visiting." She frowned slightly. "You left because of me?" "No," he answered calmly. "I stayed away because I believed you deserved peace." His voice carried no bitterness, only quiet certainty. Before Evelyn could think of another question, Adrian reached toward a nearby shelf, carefully placed a small watering can beside the orchid, and stepped backward toward the open door. "The roots are delicate," he said. "Too much water will harm them, even when they appear thirsty." With that, he disappeared into the bright winter afternoon as silently as he had entered. Evelyn remained beside the flower long after he was gone, staring at the untouched watering can and wondering whether the king had been speaking about the orchid, or about someone who had spent her entire life believing that every story she had heard was true. The days settled into a rhythm so quiet that Evelyn almost forgot she had arrived as part of a political bargain. Every morning the castle awakened with the fragrance of fresh bread drifting through long corridors while sunlight slipped across stained glass and painted ribbons of sapphire and crimson over the marble floors. Servants greeted one another by name. Gardeners laughed softly as they carried baskets of herbs through the courtyards. Children from the nearby village occasionally crossed the front bridge carrying books beneath their arms before disappearing into a modest stone building near the eastern wall. No one hurried. No one looked afraid. The stories she had grown up hearing seemed to fade a little more with each passing sunrise. One chilly afternoon, wrapped in a cream-colored cloak, Evelyn wandered farther than usual beyond the formal gardens. A narrow cobblestone path curved through rows of towering pine trees whose branches bent beneath fresh snow. She followed the distant sound of cheerful voices until the trees opened into a wide courtyard she had never seen before. Nearly 24 children chased one another around an ancient oak tree decorated with bright ribbons that fluttered in the cold breeze. Some were human. Others carried the unmistakable pale features of vampire families. They laughed together without hesitation, tossing handmade wooden rings toward painted targets while older women poured steaming cups of apple cider from iron kettles resting above glowing coals. Evelyn stopped in surprise. No walls separated them. No guards watched over them. A little girl with freckles smiled up at her and offered a carved wooden bird. "Would you like to play?" Before Evelyn could answer, a familiar figure appeared near the edge of the courtyard. Adrian stood beneath the oak tree wearing a dark wool coat instead of ceremonial clothing. Without fanfare, he knelt beside a young human boy whose scarf had come loose in the winter wind. With slow, practiced hands, Adrian retied the scarf securely around the child's neck before brushing snow from the boy's shoulder. The child grinned and hurried back toward the others without even bowing. Adrian simply watched him go, the faintest trace of satisfaction softening his otherwise reserved expression. Moments later, an elderly woman approached carrying a woven basket filled with fresh bread. "You forgot your lunch again," she said with gentle amusement. Adrian accepted the loaf with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. If you continue working through every meal, I shall continue reminding you." "I suspect you will." She laughed and lightly tapped his arm before walking away. Evelyn stared in disbelief. The most feared ruler in the kingdom had just accepted a friendly scolding from an old village baker without the slightest hint of offense. Hidden beneath the shelter of the pines, Evelyn watched as Adrian spent the next hour quietly repairing a broken swing with ordinary tools while children gathered around offering enthusiastic but mostly unhelpful advice. He listened to every suggestion as though each one deserved serious consideration. When the swing finally lifted smoothly through the crisp afternoon air, applause erupted across the courtyard. Adrian smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. It transformed his face completely, replacing centuries of solemn dignity with something warm enough to make the frozen afternoon seem less cold. Evelyn felt her heartbeat slow. None of this matched the legends. None of it matched the warnings whispered around village fireplaces throughout her childhood. She had expected to find a ruler surrounded by fear. Instead, she found a man surrounded by trust that had clearly been earned one quiet kindness at a time. As the winter sun began slipping behind the distant mountains, Adrian glanced toward the line of pine trees. For the briefest moment, his crimson eyes met Evelyn's hidden gaze across the snow. He did not call her name. He did not expose her presence. He simply inclined his head in silent acknowledgement before returning to help a little girl gather the wooden rings scattered across the frosted grass. Standing unnoticed beneath the sheltering branches, Evelyn realized that the first crack had finally appeared in the wall of fear she had spent her entire life building around a man she had never truly known. That evening, the first snowstorm of the season swept across Blackthorn Castle with quiet determination. Thick flakes drifted past the towering windows until the mountains beyond disappeared behind a curtain of white. The wind whispered through ancient stone arches while fireplaces throughout the castle filled the halls with the comforting scent of burning cedar. Evelyn stood beside her bedroom window watching the storm erase every familiar path leading toward the village. The world beyond the glass looked softer somehow, as though winter had decided to give every old scar a fresh beginning. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, the elderly housekeeper greeted her with the same warm smile she always carried. His Majesty wondered if you would join him for supper in the West Library. Only if you wish. There was no expectation hidden inside the invitation. Only a choice. Evelyn hesitated for a moment before quietly nodding. The West Library felt unlike any royal dining hall she had ever imagined. Instead of towering banquet tables stretching across enormous chambers, a modest round table had been placed beside a crackling fireplace. Shelves filled with thousands of books surrounded the room from floor to ceiling. A single lamp cast a golden circle of light over simple porcelain dishes filled with roasted vegetables, fresh bread, herb soup, baked apples, and warm tea. Adrian was already there, standing beside one of the bookshelves with a volume in his hand. He closed it as she entered and offered a respectful incline of his head. "Thank you for coming." Evelyn returned the gesture before taking her seat across from him. For several quiet moments neither of them spoke. Outside, snow tapped gently against the tall windows while the fire settled with an occasional soft crackle. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It simply existed between them like another guest sharing the room. Adrian poured tea into her cup before filling his own. "Mrs. Holloway insisted the apple bread should be served while it is still warm," he said. Evelyn almost smiled. "She seems to give you many instructions." A faint expression touched the corner of his mouth. "She has known me since I looked much younger than I do now. I learned long ago that arguing with her never changes the outcome." The unexpected humor caught Evelyn by surprise. She found herself smiling before she realized it. Adrian noticed but politely looked away, allowing the moment to remain hers. They ate quietly until Evelyn finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that had lingered since their wedding night. "Why did you leave the ceremony?" Adrian rested his teacup on its saucer with careful precision. The fire reflected softly in his crimson eyes as he searched for words. "Because everyone expected you to become a symbol before you were allowed to remain a person." Evelyn listened without interrupting. "You had already lost your home," he continued calmly. "I refused to let you lose your dignity during your first hour here as well." The room fell silent once again. Snow continued falling beyond the windows, covering the castle gardens beneath an unbroken blanket of white. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the steam rising from her tea. "I spent my whole life believing I should fear you." Adrian nodded gently. "That was the safer lesson for your world to teach." She looked back at him. "Does that bother you?" He considered the question longer than she expected. "When you live for many centuries," he answered quietly, "you discover that being misunderstood hurts far less than watching fear become an inheritance passed from one child to the next." His voice carried no resentment. Only a sadness so old it sounded almost peaceful. The firelight danced across the shelves filled with history, poetry, and forgotten dreams while neither of them spoke again for several minutes. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared. As Evelyn reached for another slice of warm apple bread, she noticed Adrian gently slide the last piece toward her side of the table without saying a word. It was such a small gesture that most people would never remember it. Yet somehow, beneath the steady glow of the fireplace and the quiet music of falling snow, it became the first moment when Evelyn stopped wondering whether she had been sent to live beside a monster and started wondering how many years a good man could survive while carrying the weight of everyone else's fear. Winter settled over Blackthorn Castle for another week, wrapping its towers in quiet layers of silver frost while the days passed with surprising peace. Evelyn slowly became part of the castle's gentle rhythm. She shared breakfast with the household staff more often than the royal dining hall, learned the names of the gardeners who carefully protected the roses through the cold season, and spent long afternoons reading beside the enormous library windows where snowflakes drifted endlessly across the valley. The fear that had accompanied her arrival no longer followed every step. Yet beyond the warm stone walls, the world had not changed as quickly as her heart had begun to. One gray morning, the calm atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Messengers arrived earlier than usual, their horses breathing clouds of white into the frozen air as castle attendants hurried to receive sealed letters marked with unfamiliar crests. Conversations stopped whenever footsteps approached. Servants exchanged brief glances before returning to their duties. Even the cheerful children no longer played near the eastern courtyard. They had quietly been asked to remain inside the village school until further notice. Evelyn noticed the difference immediately. During lunch, the usual empty chair across from her remained vacant. Adrian had not appeared. Nor did he arrive for supper. As twilight settled outside, curiosity finally overcame patience. She wandered through the western corridor until voices reached her from beneath a partially opened council chamber door. She did not intend to listen, but one sentence stopped her where she stood. The human council has withdrawn their representatives. Another voice answered with restrained concern. And the Crimson Circle refuses to recognize the marriage. A heavy silence followed. Then Adrian spoke, his calm voice unmistakable. Both responses were expected. Evelyn remained perfectly still. An older advisor continued carefully. Several noble vampire families believe the agreement has weakened the throne. Meanwhile, certain human leaders insist Your Majesty cannot be trusted regardless of the treaty. Fear rarely surrenders after signing a document, Adrian replied quietly. It usually waits for another excuse. No one answered immediately. Papers rustled across the long table. Finally another council member spoke. Your Majesty, perhaps it would be wiser if Queen Evelyn remained hidden until the political climate improves. Adrian answered without hesitation. No. The single word carried no anger. Only certainty. She has spent enough of her life allowing other people to decide where she belongs. That will not continue here. Evelyn lowered her eyes, her heartbeat suddenly louder than the voices beyond the door. She had never asked him to defend her. Yet he had done so without knowing she was listening. Before she could quietly leave, footsteps echoed from the opposite hallway. Adrian appeared around the corner carrying several rolled maps beneath one arm. He had clearly exited through another passage after the meeting had concluded. He stopped the moment he saw Evelyn standing there. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. The silence held no awkwardness, only mutual understanding. Adrian glanced briefly toward the closed council chamber before looking back at her. You were not meant to hear that conversation. Evelyn nodded honestly. I know. He waited, giving her every opportunity to ask questions she was not yet certain how to form. Instead she asked only one. Are people unhappy because of me? Adrian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. No. He shook his head gently. They are unhappy because change asks people to release stories they have believed for generations. That is never easy. Snow drifted beyond the tall windows as the evening light faded into shades of blue and silver. Evelyn searched his face for frustration or disappointment but found only quiet patience. Does it ever become easier? She asked. Adrian looked toward the falling snow before answering. Eventually. But only after someone chooses to remain kind even when suspicion would be easier. He offered her the smallest reassuring smile before continuing down the corridor toward another meeting waiting somewhere inside the endless castle. Evelyn watched him disappear around the distant corner, realizing that the greatest challenge before them had never been living under the same roof. It was convincing two frightened worlds that compassion could survive longer than fear. The storm finally passed, leaving the valley wrapped beneath a sky so clear that every snow-covered peak shimmered beneath the pale winter sun. From the highest balcony of Blackthorn Castle, Evelyn could see smoke rising peacefully from the chimneys of the nearby village while children hurried through fresh snow carrying baskets and books. It looked like the kind of morning people would remember for its quiet beauty. Yet inside the castle, the atmosphere carried a different weight. Guards spoke in lower voices. Messengers continued arriving from distant territories. Every letter seemed to bring another reminder that peace remained fragile. Shortly after sunrise, Mrs. Holloway approached Evelyn with an unusual request. His Majesty is visiting the Western Bridge this morning. The recent snowfall damaged part of the old crossing. Supplies cannot reach the village until it is inspected. Evelyn offered to help distribute blankets and food once the route reopened. The elderly woman smiled warmly. He will appreciate knowing that. Curious, Evelyn wrapped herself in a heavy wool cloak and followed the winding forest path leading toward the western ridge. The air smelled wonderfully clean after the storm, carrying the scent of pine and melting ice. Sunlight reflected from the snow so brightly that the entire mountainside seemed to glow. When she reached the bridge, she found Adrian already there with several engineers and local craftsmen. There were no royal banners. No formal ceremony. Adrian stood beside the workers studying weathered wooden beams while listening carefully to every suggestion they offered. He thanked each person individually before helping move measuring ropes and stacks of fresh timber into place. To Evelyn's surprise, no one treated him as someone too important to work beside them. He simply became another pair of willing hands. As repairs continued, a sudden cracking sound echoed across the narrow ravine. Everyone instinctively looked upward. A thick layer of snow resting high along the rocky slope had begun sliding downward after the morning sunlight loosened its grip. It was not a massive avalanche, but enough snow and loose branches tumbled toward the unfinished section of the bridge to send workers quickly stepping back toward safer ground. One young apprentice froze in place, startled by the unexpected movement and uncertain which direction to run. Before anyone else reacted, Adrian crossed the remaining distance with remarkable speed. He reached the frightened young man, guided him gently toward solid ground, and positioned himself between the falling snow and the worker until the last of the loose ice scattered harmlessly across the empty section of the bridge. The entire moment lasted only seconds. When everything became still again, Adrian calmly brushed melting snow from his dark coat as though nothing unusual had happened. "Is everyone all right?" he asked first, looking toward the workers instead of himself. The apprentice nodded repeatedly, his face pale from surprise rather than injury. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Adrian placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "You remembered to stay calm. That helped more than you realize." The engineers resumed their work after confirming that everyone was safe. Evelyn remained standing several yards away, unable to look anywhere except at Adrian. No applause followed. No grand speech celebrated what had just happened. The king quietly picked up the measuring rope he had dropped moments earlier and returned to discussing bridge repairs as though protecting another person had simply been the most ordinary decision imaginable. On the journey back toward the castle, they walked together through the snow-covered forest in comfortable silence. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "You stepped in without thinking." Adrian glanced toward the pine trees swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. "When someone is frightened," he answered softly, "they should never have to wonder whether they are facing it alone." Evelyn lowered her eyes, remembering every story she had once believed about the Vampire King. None of those stories had mentioned the man who would place himself in the cold without hesitation simply to make certain someone else reached warmth first. As the castle towers appeared beyond the trees, Evelyn realized something had changed inside her without asking permission. Gratitude had quietly replaced suspicion, and for the first time since crossing the gates of Blackthorn Castle, the place before her no longer felt like the home of a stranger. It was beginning to feel like the home of a man whose quiet courage spoke louder than every fearful legend ever told about him. Several days passed after the visit to the Western Bridge, and with each sunrise the castle seemed to breathe a little easier. The roads reopened, merchants returned to the village square, and the laughter of children once again drifted through the courtyards like birdsong carried on the cold wind. Yet beneath the calm routine, Adrian continued disappearing for hours without explanation. He attended council meetings before dawn, answered messages long after sunset, and quietly carried responsibilities no one else seemed able to shoulder. He never spoke about them. He simply continued showing up wherever he was needed. One snowy afternoon, Evelyn wandered into the oldest wing of Blackthorn Castle while searching for a book Mrs. Holloway had recommended. Dust floated through narrow beams of winter sunlight that slipped between stained glass windows, illuminating shelves so old that the wood had darkened with centuries. Near the back of the library she noticed an unlocked door she had never seen before. Beyond it waited a circular archive lined with towering cabinets filled with journals, maps, and carefully preserved records. In the center of the room stood an enormous oak table where several ancient scrolls had been left open. Evelyn approached cautiously, intending only to satisfy her curiosity. One weathered parchment immediately caught her attention. At the top, written in elegant calligraphy, were the words, "The Covenant of the Two Kingdoms." She recognized the royal seal beneath the title. Slowly, she began reading. The first pages described generations of conflict, failed negotiations, broken promises, and long winters shaped by fear rather than understanding. But farther down, another section had been added centuries later in different handwriting. It spoke of a future ruler who would preserve peace not through conquest, but through trust freely given. Evelyn frowned. That was not how the treaty had been explained to her family. She reached for another document resting beside it. This one contained personal letters exchanged between former rulers. As she carefully turned each fragile page, a different truth emerged. Adrian had never requested a political marriage. In fact, years earlier he had repeatedly proposed trade agreements, shared schools, and open borders instead of royal unions. Every proposal had been rejected by leaders on both sides who feared losing influence more than they desired lasting peace. Then she found the final letter, dated only weeks before her arrival. It carried Adrian's unmistakable handwriting. "If one marriage prevents another generation from inheriting fear, then I will accept the burden without complaint. History may misunderstand my reasons, but perhaps one day the people themselves will not." Evelyn read the sentence again, her vision blurring not with tears, but with disbelief. He had never sought a bride. He had accepted loneliness because every other path toward peace had been closed. The marriage had not been his victory. It had been his sacrifice. Soft footsteps echoed behind her. Evelyn turned to find Mrs. Holloway standing quietly in the doorway, her hands folded gently before her. The elderly woman offered a knowing smile. "You found the letters." Evelyn nodded slowly, still holding the final page. "Why did no one tell me?" Mrs. Holloway looked toward the snow falling beyond the round library windows. "Because His Majesty never wished kindness to become another argument in his favor. He believes goodness loses something precious the moment it asks for recognition." Silence settled gently over the archive. Evelyn carefully returned every letter to its proper place, her fingertips lingering for a moment on the aged paper. She thought about the lonely figure standing beside the frozen fountain on her first night, the untouched meals prepared according to her preferences, the children laughing beneath the oak tree, the quiet dinner beside the fireplace, the patient words offered without expectation, and the man who always stepped forward first whenever someone else needed safety. As the afternoon light faded into the soft blue of approaching evening, Evelyn understood the truth that no rumor had ever carried. The greatest act of love was not asking someone to choose you. Sometimes it was choosing to protect their future, even if they never discovered why. Spring arrived quietly in the valley beneath Blackthorn Castle. The snow that had covered the mountains for months surrendered to clear streams that sparkled beneath the morning sun, carrying fresh water through fields where the first wildflowers began pushing gently through the earth. The old oak tree in the village square wore bright green leaves once again, and children filled the air with laughter as they chased one another across the grass without caring which family name or bloodline each belonged to. Life had not become perfect. Old doubts still lingered in distant kingdoms, and cautious voices still questioned whether lasting peace could truly exist. But inside the castle walls, something far more important had already changed. One evening, as the golden light of sunset stretched across the western gardens, Adrian stood alone beside the ancient stone fountain where he had disappeared on the night of the wedding months before. The water reflected the sky in shades of amber and blue while petals from blooming cherry trees drifted across its quiet surface. He had come there seeking a few peaceful moments before another council meeting. Soft footsteps approached behind him. He turned and found Evelyn walking slowly along the garden path. She wore a simple pale blue dress instead of formal royal clothing, her white cloak resting lightly over her shoulders as the gentle spring breeze played with loose strands of her golden hair. Neither of them hurried to speak. The silence between them had changed over the passing months. It no longer belonged to strangers learning how to share the same space. It belonged to two people who had learned that trust often grows best when no one forces it. Evelyn stopped beside the fountain and looked at the water for a long moment before reaching into the pocket of her cloak. She carefully removed the silver wedding ring she had quietly carried every day without wearing it. Adrian watched without saying a word. There was no expectation in his eyes. No hope demanding an answer. Only the same patient kindness that had greeted her from the very beginning. Evelyn looked at the ring resting in her palm before lifting her eyes to meet his. "The first night I arrived," she said softly, "I believed I had lost my future." Adrian remained silent. "Then I thought you were simply being polite." She smiled gently. "Later I believed you were kind." The evening breeze carried the fragrance of blooming roses through the garden. Birds settled quietly among the castle towers as the sun continued its slow descent beyond the mountains. Evelyn stepped one pace closer and placed the silver ring upon her finger of her own free will. The simple movement seemed almost too small to matter. Yet it carried more meaning than every royal ceremony that had come before it. Adrian looked at her with quiet surprise. After a long moment, he asked the same question that had remained in his heart since the wedding day. "Are you still being forced?" Evelyn smiled, and for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Castle, her smile carried no fear, no uncertainty, and no obligation. "No," she answered. "I am choosing to stay." Adrian lowered his eyes for just a moment, as though absorbing words he had never expected to hear. Then he offered the smallest smile she had ever seen, one that reached his eyes with gentle warmth instead of quiet sorrow. No audience witnessed the moment. No royal trumpets announced it. Beyond the garden walls, village bells rang softly as families gathered for supper, completely unaware that history had changed without speeches, without celebrations, and without anyone demanding to be remembered. Months later, travelers crossing the valley noticed something unusual. Human merchants and vampire craftsmen worked beside one another rebuilding roads, planting orchards, and opening new schools where children learned the same lessons beneath the same roof. Whenever curious visitors asked how such an impossible peace had begun, the villagers rarely spoke about treaties or royal politics. They simply smiled and pointed toward the castle on the hill, where two figures could sometimes be seen walking through the gardens beneath the evening sky. One had spent centuries believing he would always be misunderstood. The other had once believed fear was the safest path. Together they discovered that kindness asked for nothing, yet quietly changed everything. And as the first stars appeared above Blackthorn Castle, they reflected in the fountain just as they always had, but for the first time in countless generations, they reflected a future built not upon fear of what made people different, but upon the quiet courage to see one another simply as human at heart.